DC is hosting the NATO summit downtown this week. Now, NATO has been at the center of the Western world's defense strategy for 75 years now, countering communist and fascist threats alike. However, in today's world, the greatest threat to democratic and Western societies comes again from communism, but this time not on NATO's borders. Obviously, we're alluding to China here. And Miles, you sent me a piece that you wrote in the summer of 2022 about NATO, but with a different acronym. It was NAPTO. That's NAIPTO, North Atlantic Indo-Pacific Treaty Organization. Now, this alliance doesn't exist right now, but you argue that it should and it could. So a twofold question here to start. What do you have your eye on this week during the summit in DC, and how could an Asia-focused NATO actually come about?
Well, it will become a talk of the town after this show. Well, I think
like the
NATO,
confidence.
That's right. Well, United States is not only an Atlantic country, it's also a Pacific country. We've been saying that for a long time. That's why the summit is very important, because it symbolizes actually the transition of the focus of the global strategic priorities away from Europe, away from the Middle East, and to Indo-Pacific, more specifically focusing on the China threat. Much like 75 years ago, Western Europe faced the central threat from the Soviet Union. NATO was created in April 1949 to face this threatening menace called the Soviet Union. Every major country in Western Europe had this problem. So there was a common threat. So common threat was the foundation for common defense. And therefore, NATO is a multilateral collective defense alliance for common defense. And this has been the most successful multilateral collective defense alliance in human history, in my view.
Yeah.
So 75 years is a very short time in human history, but in terms of peace, it's a very, very long time. The 75 years of peace is a testimony to the absolute necessity to have such an alliance system. United States obviously is a global power. It has a global alliance. Our European security is guaranteed through this North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Asia Pacific is lacking. Yes, we have a very strong alliance in Asia. We have many allies too, but they're all exclusively bilateral in nature. That is, the United States has a very strong defense alliance with Japan, with South Korea, and with the Philippines. But Japan, Philippines, South Korea themselves were not treaty bound. They were not part of the collective multilateral defense system. So that's where the meaning of NATO lies. That is, we're going to transform NATO alliance into something of a global nature. That is will no longer be a European security alliance, but also a global security alliance. The reason for that is now we're facing a global threat posed by both Russia and China, the scale of which is global, not regional at all. NATO has been saying this in the last several years when American strategic focus has shifted from Europe, from the Middle East to China. And General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg, the outgoing chief of NATO, has been saying all along that peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in places like Taiwan Strait and South China Sea, should also be NATO's business. So it is very important and significant for the 75th anniversary of the NATO alliance being celebrated in Washington, D.C., because it is truly a global alliance, is a kumbaya for world democracies.
So you're not actually arguing for a separate NATO-style alliance in Asia, but actually adding countries in Asia to the alliance as a buffer against China. Is there real traction for something like this to be discussed this week?
It will be easier for NATO membership expansion to include Asia countries. Many countries in Asia facing the China threat are thinking about this, particularly Japan. Japan in the last couple of years has been actively courting NATO to request a NATO, at least the office first in Tokyo. And NATO countries have some kind of a mechanism in intelligence, in sharing, and in some other specific areas in terms of military connection with Japan, South Korea, and as well, and the United States, obviously. On the other hand, I don't think expansion of membership of the NATO to include Asian countries like Japan, like Australia, like South Korea, like the Philippines, even India, if you so choose it, is the only way to make this happen. That is, in addition to the expansion of membership to include nation ATOs, therefore transferring the name of NATO to NIPTO, that is North Atlantic Indo-Pacific Treaty Organization, as we indicated at the beginning of the show. We can also basically create an entirely new, different kind of a system in Asia-Pacific that is modeled after the NATO multilateral collective defense system. That could be the same thing. Now, we did try the same kind of experiment in the 1950s and 60s in the form of SEATO, that is Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. It didn't work out precisely because it lacked two basic ingredients for a multilateral collective defense system like NATO. Number one, you should have a common threat. Number two, you should have some kind of shared common values among the member states.
Right.
Now, on those accounts, it was pretty absent because, number one, not every country in Southeast Asia after World War II felt the threat of communism, which should be considered as imminent. Many countries in Southeast Asia had just emerged from European colonialism. So there are anti-communist as well as anti-Western in a way. Number two, many of the countries in Southeast Asia that were Americans' allies against communism were actually dictatorships, like the Philippines, like Taiwan, like South Korea. And that's why it didn't work out very well. But now,
the timing is much better.
Situation has changed dramatically because you do have a common thread. Every country in the region, from South Korea to Japan to Taiwan to Philippines to India to Vietnam to Malaysia, virtually every neighbor of China in Southeast and East and Northwest Asia feel the common threat from China. So common threat calls for common defense. Secondly, most of the countries that were dictatorships in the Cold War era have become vibrant democracies, particularly Taiwan, South Korea, and the Philippines. So we have some kind of common values to defend for, and that's why I think the time is ripe, is now, to form a NATO-like multilateral collective defense system where attack on one member is attack on all.
Yeah. So you mentioned a couple specific countries there, but drilling down, who would be the most likely to join, but who would be the most important to join for it to actually be effective?
Well, first of all, I think Japan, Australia are very likely to join first.
Yeah.
Japan, as a matter of fact, after Prime Minister Kishida announced this amazing, almost like about face of Japanese defense posture a couple of years ago.
Yeah, right.
That abandoned Japanese defense-oriented strategy to an offense and preemptive strike capability focused defense posture, increasing Japan's defense spending up to 2% of Japanese GDP. And the first trip that the Prime Minister Kishida of Japan visited was not Washington, D.C., was Brussels. And he directly appeals to the NATO leadership for a closer tie of these two entities. NATO responded very positively. For the last several years, NATO has traditionally invited leaders of South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand to its annual summit, either in Spain and now in Washington, D.C. So it is a really good sort of mutual agreement I would say, you ask me the countries, I would say Australia, Japan are most likely, followed by New Zealand and South Korea.
Okay. Are there any current countries in NATO that are pushing back on this type of expansion, that are saying, hey, we don't have any business having a defense treaty in the South China Sea and expanding this to another region?
Yes, there's probably 1.5 countries. Right?
Okay.
The one country that really vigorously opposed this idea is France. France can be difficult all the time.
Yeah.
The French have had a very difficult relationship with the NATO. Remember, the French withdrew from NATO for a long time. And the NATO headquarters used to be in Paris. Now, after the French withdrawal, they moved to Brussels. So the French president, Macron, did not really like this idea of NATO membership expansion at all. He thought it was provocative unnecessarily, and he also opposed NATO's potential connection with Japan, even though it was very, very preliminary and very decent. But then that's the expected because they're French. And another half country is Hungary. Hungary obviously is in the pockets of China, to put it very bluntly. So, and the NATO, unfortunately, requires unanimous consent for membership expansion and many other things. Again, we don't have to really expand NATO membership to Asia Pacific. We just need to create some NATO-like alliance to enhance multilateral nature of the NATO alliance in Asia. The reason we should have that is because it might provide the best deterrence against China. Chinese tactics has always been against violently the formation of any joint free nations against China's expansion. So that's one of the things that if all also band together to form multilateral defense alliance, that would be a great deterrence to China.
One last question. I feel like there's a couple countries on the fence there that you didn't mention as most likely. India, Vietnam, the Philippines. How would they react to the establishment of something like this? Would they be likely to join, which would completely change the alliance and create a real buffer against China?
Well, obviously, each country has its own unique history and has a very sort of storied interactions with the Western-led alliances. India and Vietnam in particular. Again, this is not a required membership for cooperation with the U.S.-led alliance. It's a membership based on voluntary basis. You can join or you cannot join, but definitely membership has its privileges. Many countries in Europe are very sort of not very sure about the efficacy and usefulness of NATO. But then when they feel their national security was threatened, they would abandon their pretense and they join NATO. The best example of late is the new membership of Sweden and Finland. There's two sort of definitely moderate and neutral country, and they join NATO. So that's because they feel the same kind of common threat from Russia. So I would assume, the countries like Vietnam and India, they do have their independent path to a modern world, but they also face the same kind of threat as Japan and South Korea and any other countries that might become a new NATO membership in Asia.
Moving on to our next topic, it's in strong correlation to this one. We're actually tracking China's increased aggression last week around the South China Sea. In one incident, they seized a Taiwanese fishing vessel they claimed was operating too close to their territory. And in another, PLA sailors clashed with Filipino armed forces, causing multiple injuries. You can actually see in the video of the altercation. I mean, at one point, a Chinese Navy speedboat speeds up and intentionally rams a boat filled with Filipino soldiers. So we've got a passive provocation with Taiwan over here and a direct physical confrontation with the Philippines in the same week. So give me some perspective here for those of us who don't track the South China Sea happenings regularly. Is this just a typical week for Chinese actions in the sea, or is this an uptick? What's the significance or even strategy behind these moves?
Of course, all these provocations came from one source, that China has a massive and illegal claims of maritime territories. In addition to the claim of land territories with many of the other land neighbors. So, but this is a constant problem. China has had this problem with South Korean law enforcement, Japanese maritime law enforcement, Taiwan definitely, and the Philippines. So, and Vietnam as well. It is a pattern, all based upon China's claim of these territories that are disputed by other countries. In Chinese perspective, this is actually a matter of law enforcement. But the entire claim is unlawful, and they have no jurisdiction in this area to conduct such a move. So in these two specific cases you mentioned, the Taiwan. So last week, a Taiwanese fishing boat accidentally entered the 12 nautical mile line by about half a mile. So the Chinese maritime police seized that vessel and then brought it back to China, where the crew still being detained. And this caused a big stir in Taiwan, and that's because this is a very rare case where Chinese actually detain Taiwanese fishermen and escalating the tension between the already tense cross-strait relationship. And the confrontation with the Filipino fishing vessels were even worse. And a little while earlier, a fisherman's Filipino personnel's finger was cut off by a Chinese axe. So it's very tense.
Yeah, you could see in the video they were like swinging axes and at each other.
It's like a melee. It's a very very serious problem.
Oh yeah.
Now what's interesting here is this. In a Taiwanese fisherman case, China claimed this fisherman violated the Chinese 12 nautical mile territorial water. That's actually implicitly, it says China really treat Taiwan as a separate country because, it has its own sovereign water demarcation with Taiwan. And nobody is exploring this kind of contradiction. And I think we should think about this.
I like that.
Yeah.
If they were one country, they just would have been in their own waters, right?
That's right. Another thing is China has not really considered this kind of reciprocal consequences to the Chinese fishermen because Chinese fishermen have been known illegally fishing in other people's territories, at least in their EEZ zones, for many, many years and on a massive scale. If other countries take reciprocal actions, I think it's going to be very harmful to China's own personnel at high sea conducting illegal moves, fishing at least. I think the best way is right now is that there should be some kind of clearly defined international maritime law enforcement mechanisms, establish some kind of rules of engagement. Much of this is because there is no such clearly defined international rules of engagement. So I think hopefully, through incidents like this, the international community, particularly maritime authorities, should really work out the issue of jurisdiction and methods of law enforcement.
The Asia-focused NATO alliance would certainly have something to say about that if that were in effect alluding to our past topic. And the U.S. did actually offer to help the Filipino forces in the incident, but Manila turned it down. What's the context for that offer and for their refusal?
Well, that the U.S. offer is pretty serious because the U.S. and the Philippines have a mutual defense agreement. In other words, any vessels, any Filipino assets, airplane or vehicles or personnel comes under attack by a third country, U.S. is treaty bound to defend the Filipinos against that third country. U.S. offered, but of course, the Filipino did not take it for fear of further escalation. And I think this probably is the right thing to do for the Filipinos. But the Chinese should know that U.S. were there to help. And precisely because of Americans' posture to offer Filipino help, I think China right now actually scaled back this week to send a sort of olive branch to Manila, seeking for some kind of efforts to de-escalate the tension in the maritime domain. That's how powerful Americans' interference could be. for the better.
Yeah. The power of an American phone call.
Absolutely. Even an American statement.
And to wrap us up, Miles, you are actually in Taipei right now, which is the reason behind your sound quality. But you're in Taipei for the second installment for a Taiwanese anti-secession law conference. You had the first one last month in D.C. So tell us a little bit about your trip, who you're meeting, and what you're looking to accomplish while you're there.
Yeah, so China adopted the law in 2005. It's called anti-secession law. That basically, presumably provides the legal framework to China to launch a military invasion of Taiwan, the free and vibrant democracy. And we had a very successful conference in Hudson in Washington, D.C. So this is the second installment of that conference here in Taipei. And we are coordinating with the Institute of National Defense and Security Research here in Taipei. And we had a wonderful meeting last Friday, all-day meeting, and with the legal scholars from top universities in the United States, as well as experts from Taiwan and from the INDSR Institute. We have gained a lot of media attention, and virtually the main event of that day for Taiwan is about this conference. And we also benefited from the fact that because China has taken out many of the international journalism, so you have a large press corps here in Taipei, including New York Times, Newsweek, Financial Times, CNN. They all came to the conference, and we have a very robust debate about the pernicious impact of China's 2005 anti-secession law that, again, provides the legal justification for China's invasion of Taiwan.
So what does a successful trip look like?
So like we discussed some of the very important questions, and we actually came to a conclusion. And the conclusion is that the Chinese 2005 anti-secession law, it was not even illegal, and it was also very badly written documents. It provided no legal efficacy or justification for even its own existence. It could not pass the bar of international treaty and international law, and therefore it's not really enforceable in a way.